Hello and welcome to the pod. I'm Nathan Fink.
I'm Jasmine Torres Allen, and this is New Hampshire Family Now,
a show about building family in the Granite State. Today in the podcast, co-host Jasmine and I talk Juneteenth and the opportunity to learn more, and later theorist and practitioner of racial justice organizing, advocacy, and media, Rinku Sen discusses the incredible power of friendship. New Hampshire Family Now is brought to you by the New Hampshire Charitable Foundation. Since 1962, the Charitable Foundation has worked hand in hand with generous and visionary citizens to maximize the power of giving and support, collaborate, and lead innovative initiatives. Initiatives like New Hampshire Tomorrow, which is focused on making sure children and families have access to education, healthcare, and career pathways to ensure every family member thrives. To learn more about New Hampshire Charitable Foundation and all their initiatives, go to www.nhcf.org. This podcast was also brought to you by Family Support New Hampshire. Family Support New Hampshire is NH's coalition of family resource centers and family strengthening programs that exist to ensure Granite State families have access to resources so both caregivers and children can succeed. Because supported families are strong families. To find a family resource center near you, visit www.fsnh.org. Jasmine, it's so good to see you. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Nathan.
Also, I apologize for what happened in the elevator. I literally was like, dude, I'm going to look at her. I'm not going to say a word. And we're going to hang with it the next thing you know.
And it's hard because I'm a person who's like, naturally you get into conversation.
I know. And it goes deep quick.
Yeah, I have that tendency.
But I, again, appreciate you always taking the time. And please tell me you're learning something.
Of course I am. I'm always learning on Jasmine Learns Something. And, I shared something super vulnerable today, which was that, I didn't learn about Juneteenth until I was an adult.
But why do you say that's vulnerable?
And I say that's vulnerable because I feel like there are a lot of individuals who are afraid to say that they don't know about Juneteenth and that there's a lot of gaps that weren't filled, in our general education. When it comes around this holiday, there are people who are like, what do I do? Are you trying to figure out, how do I support? Do I say anything? Do I post anything? And there's always you notice that there's like a ball of nerves almost because you don't feel like you should talk about it or,
right.
You don't feel like the right person talk about it. And so I think there should be conversation about it's vulnerable to say, I don't know about something and that I need to learn about it.
Thank you for saying that, because all of a sudden, as you said it, I'm just like, oh, I didn't know either.
Well, it wasn't a federal holiday until last year, actually. It became a federal holiday. And then it was actually started in Galveston, Texas. Texas was one of the last states to free their slaves. It didn't end with the Emancipation Proclamation. It took almost 2 or 3 years before people realized that they were free. And so when the news reached to Galveston, Texas, the slaves there actually got together, and some slave owners actually offered slaves $40 to stay on the plantation. And almost all of them said no. They celebrate Juneteenth because that was the day the Emancipation Proclamation was announced to them at Galveston, Texas. And one of the things that is a part of the Juneteenth celebration is red foods, which I was like, oh, red foods, that's interesting. Why are we eating red foods on Juneteenth? And it turns out that we eat red foods on Juneteenth because we celebrate the sacrifices and the bloodshed of all the slaves previous to that time before the Emancipation Proclamation was read.
Right.
There was a lot of history behind that we don't even know. Like back in the day, you had to read out the Emancipation Proclamation. So there were a lot of states that didn't, free their slaves or chose to keep that information.
And it's not, if I'm not mistaken, a state recognized holiday as of yet.
That's right.
Back to the feeling you had when you realized you were, embarrassed maybe a little bit that you didn't know.
Yeah.
Where did you start?
It actually started back in college for me when I was a part of a Latino heritage group. And we got together. We were going to try to celebrate Juneteenth. And at the time, I just didn't know about it. And I had to ask, I was like, why are we celebrating this? And so, those colleagues at the time took the time to educate me, but then I had to take the step further and educate myself. And I decided to go to Washington, D.C. and go to the museums and understand and really make an effort to try to learn Black history. You know what I mean? And so that was a personal journey for me. And that's not always the case. And that's not something people always want to do.
How did you get over that hump of embarrassment? And let me frame that a little differently, because
I know, because even when I worded it, I said, it was some form of embarrassment, but I even changed the wording for that because I can't be embarrassed that that the teaching that happened during my education, that wasn't included. Like that was so out of my control. And so, being in college, right, having that college education leaves you a little bit more in control of what you learn.
I do think that there's an inflection point in people. And we were talking about that previously about, how you identify with certain stigmas or information or labels and titles. In that inflection point, you are either embarrassed by what you don't know, or you're curious to know what you don't know. And I get why you turn in one direction. Like, it's easier sometimes to just say self-preservation. I would rather not be perceived as someone who doesn't know this history. Therefore, I'm not even going to go down that path.
Right.
But then you'll never actually learn that history or that skill or that whatever it is. How do you, I guess the question here is, how do you take that potential quote unquote embarrassment and then change it into, well, this is going to be my mindset henceforth?
That's a really good question. I think that you have to be not afraid to make a mistake, because as you're learning, you're going to make mistakes. You're going to say things incorrectly, and people are, especially nowadays, they're going to call you out on it. And I think that we have to be a little bit more brave about making that mistake and being corrected and not taking that personally or offensive. I think that we can take those moments and say, oh, thank you for correcting me. I will, moving forward, I will learn and I will change the verbiage, or I will, say something different. But I think there's a lot of fear about being called out for doing something wrong, or saying the wrong thing, or maybe putting something together and, did it all wrong, and you're just you're afraid to be wrong. And so
and because to my mind, there's a couple of things. There's many things in there, so thank you for all of it. But a couple of things. One, you are not the mistakes you made. You're responsible for how you respond to those mistakes. It's rupture and repair. Actually, if Loretta Elsie Brady ever hears this, thank you again for rupture and repair, because the idea that how you repair is the only thing that I want to be remembered for. Yeah. As a person and as a parent and as anything.
Exactly. Because then when as we get older and we evolve, right, and our kids are calling us out on all of the stuff that we did back in the day, we want to be able to be like, hey, you know what? That was a mistake.
You should have seen some of the jeans I used to wear.
Oh, no.
And when we come back, Rinku Sen joins us. Don't go anywhere. Many thanks to New Hampshire's Office of Social and Emotional Wellness for sponsoring this podcast. Started within New Hampshire's Department of Education, the Office of Social and Emotional Wellness consolidates policy development and implements projects and programs that are focused on health and wellness with an emphasis on behavioral health of all students, youth, and families. To learn more about the Department of Education and its many programs and approaches, visit www.education.nh.gov. Today's show was also brought to you by Burgu Media, a full-service media company dedicated to helping nonprofits realize impact stories for print, video, social, and legacy media, and more. Both budget-conscious and grant-friendly, Burgu Media helps your organization celebrate the humans in human services. Learn more at burgumedia.com. Hey, it's Nathan, co-host of New Hampshire Family Now. I wanted to take a quick break from the show because it occurred to me that I've never asked you to subscribe to this podcast. Subscribing is free, and when you do it, it helps our placement algorithms, making it that much easier for caregivers across New Hampshire to find valuable information and strategies for their families. Also, you'll be alerted when a new episode drops. And if you like the show, leaving a review helps us that much more. So go to wherever you get your podcast, type in New Hampshire Family Now, and as the kids say, smash that subscribe button. I say click it, because if you smash it, then you're going to need a new one. Thank you and enjoy today's podcast. Hello and welcome back to the podcast. Today I'm incredibly excited to welcome Executive Director of the Narrative Initiative, Rinku Sen, widely read and respected theorist and practitioner of racial justice, organizing, advocacy, and media. Rinku, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. So great to be here.
It was great to see you at the Endowment for Health's annual meeting and ask a question of you. So this is a perfect follow-up. So if you feel cornered, I'm sorry.
That's okay. I'm good.
So I love narrative. And when I had heard you start start to talk through the work of the Narrative Initiative, I thought, man, we got to have this conversation. So bring us up to speed. What is the work of the Narrative Initiative and how does it approach achieving its mission?
Well, our work is to unite with social movements. We are part of social movements and help those movements develop the power to make their ideas saturate the society and become the norm that then guides decisions that we make individually and collectively in government, in business, in culture. So the way we define narrative is that it is the ideas and themes that are embedded in collections of stories. So, the common definition of narrative is that it is a story. Maybe it's a little story, maybe it's the big story. And the story is definitely important to narrative, but it's the moral of the story that we want to move, that we help our partners and participants and colleagues get clear about. What are the morals of the stories that we want to move? How do we get control over the conversation that happens about the issues and the communities that we are trying to advance and build power with?
You just shot me right back through time when you started to talk about morals of the story. But I think first and foremost, I want to know how you came to this work.
I think that my path to this work started when I was a child. I was an immigrant child. My family came from India in 1972. My father was an aluminum engineer, and the first community we landed in was Ellenville in the Hudson Valley of New York State, where there was an aluminum factory where my dad had a job. Rural community otherwise. I learned to speak English in a 2-room schoolhouse with white and Latino classmates. And as soon as I could read in English, I became a really serious reader. We were a library family by the time I was 8. So every Friday night we'd go to the library. I'd turn in my 10 books and get another 10 books and read them all that week. So I have always loved stories. They were my path to citizenship, I could say. And once I started organizing in college, I was studying literature and I was organizing around racial justice and politics. And 40 years later, what I do now, roughly 40 years later, what I do now is really try to bring all of my different kinds of experiences and interest in stories together with a political project of making better multiracial democracy.
From what you're saying, there was then a realization about control. These are the narratives of all of us, and yet some narratives are actually positioned over other narratives. And so I want to talk about that idea. Is there a moment, a period, or something like that in your life where you realize this thing has a value structure and some are up there and some aren't?
Yeah. The period that comes to mind was, I would put it in the late 90s. So by 1988, I was on an organizing staff at the Center for Third World Organizing. By 95, 96, 97, we had done a bunch of organizing in different cities around different issues. We had won some things, especially at the local level. So after doing a lot of organizing and writing about it a lot, I just began to grapple more with the media context in which we were doing our stuff, become more and more interested in how journalism set boundaries or opened up space for political ideas and solutions ideas. And it was by 2001, I had decided to go to journalism school. I felt like I really needed to understand what mainstream reporters and editors thought of as a good story.
So what did that experience of studying journalism teach you about the way we select stories, how we pick one and raise it up?
That's a really good question. I loved journalism school. I went to Columbia. I was in the part-time graduate program in the Graduate School of Journalism. I was working full-time as communications director at the Applied Research Center. And because I was going to Columbia and coming from progressive racial justice politics, lots of people told me I would have political problems at the school. But I didn't go there looking for political problems. And it's not that they weren't there, but I found a ton of support among my professors and peers for the kinds of reporting I wanted to do, which turned out to be about organizing. So I thought journalism school was going to take me into some story realm that was separate from politics and community organizing and the places I had been. But actually, it ended up taking me deeper into the process of organizing. And after I got out, I ended up building color lines from a quarterly print magazine journal about race and organizing into a daily news site that would reach many, many, many more people and actually be able to popularize racial justice ideas.
This is a really messy question because it's more of a thought. So stick with me on this, because I keep thinking about narrative and what it does to our projection of our own journeys and ourselves. And it causes, say, a relationship between how we understand the world and our journey and our place in it. And what I'm hearing from you is that there was kind of this expected response. Like you came into journalism school thinking that it would essentially back you off of certain things, but it got you deeper, which means to my mind that it changed the relationship with which you viewed certain things. And so I'm thinking about this relationship as a big moniker here, because it feels like what you're saying is all about relationship and changing the relationship that we have with different narratives, with different segments of the population, and with people. Can you kind of talk into that idea?
Yeah, I think, and with ourselves. One of the narrative interventions that I'm proudest of having made possible was while I was working at Race Forward, my prior organization, where we ran colorlines.com, the daily news site. One of the campaigns we did was the Drop the I Word campaign. So we had been working on immigration issues and with immigrants. And as I mentioned, I myself am an immigrant for maybe 10 or 15 years. And over that period, illegal immigrant, that phrasing had become actually more present and more saturating. It was by the strategy of the anti-immigrant movement, or, immigrant restrictionist movement. So we ran a campaign to get the Associated Press, whose style guide really the majority of news outlets around the world use that are writing in English or producing in English. And that style guide tells outlets how to talk about issues and people. So we ran a campaign to get the AP to take illegal immigrant out of the style guide and to recommend other language. It took 2.5, almost 3 years of campaigning and lots of different people getting involved in the question of, should we use that language or not? Was it accurate? Was it honorable, ethical journalism to use it? And they changed it. And right after they changed the policy, I went to a conference of community college students in Washington State, largely students of color. And one of the students came up to me, young Latino person, and said, I just wanted to thank you for doing that campaign. My family has people with all kinds of statuses in it. We're mixed status family. And every day waking up and seeing the newspaper and hearing ourselves described that way by everybody in the mainstream, having that element of our daily life removed is such a relief. I just have to tell you, it's like takes a huge weight off of us so that we can live and do what we need to do. I think the big realization I have had over time is that every form of power is connected to the other forms of power. So if your self-image is a form of power, I see myself as a person with power or a person without power, that is connected to the actual exercise of political power, for example. To exercise political power, you're going to want to know a little bit about why the economy, for example, which runs our lives, goes the way it does. So the power embedded in what we know, in our capacity for action to do something, and in how we see ourselves, those are all connected. So when I went to journalism school, I thought of narrative tactically. I thought of it as like, I'm going to learn these story things, and then I'm going to apply them tactically to political strategy. But they're not connected at the tactical level. They're connected at the strategy level, at the goals level. What are we trying to accomplish with whom? And then we can really think about how. Those are the tactics. So if you're thinking about what your demands are, who you're going to organize with, where you're going to change power relations of any kind, you also have to be thinking about that in narrative terms. What are the ideas to move in through what collections of stories?
It's interesting that kind of that realization, that tactic versus strategy, because, if we think about things as tactics, it almost automatically disconnects you from the humanity that surrounds the thing you're trying to achieve, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, never have I gone into a argument, not even an argument, a situation and said, I'm looking to execute this tactic, which makes me think again about that idea of relationship, because while we're changing our relationships to words, to stories, we're also changing our relationship to each other. How does relationship to each other translate in this work?
Well, I have been thinking about this a lot in looking at the models for relating to each other that we have, for organizing, for advocacy, for civics and politics. And I think what has become popular in recent years is the notion of being good allies to one another and showing up for one another. And I've been trying to push myself and push the people around me, anybody who's willing to listen, past the notion of alliances toward the notion of friendships. Because as I've looked at my own life and at the social change efforts that I think have actually succeeded, it turns out that there are groups of friends at the center of all of those. And that they do think of each other as friends and allow themselves to be changed by that friendship. The same is not so true of alliances, which are often more tactical. We will get together in this campaign in order to win a thing that we both want, or in order to support out of altruism and solidarity, something that community near us wants, a community that we want to support wants. And I'm looking for a set of relationships that are more equivalent in their power relationship, in their asks of each other, in their joint project of building the common good. So I've been thinking a lot about friendship, and I have collected anecdotes, and it turns out there's also some real research from sociologists and historians that backs up my theory that friendship is a solid driver of social change.
So then if this is the work of the Narrative Initiative, we're kind of on this pathway to cause authentic opportunities for authentic relationships. How do you go about doing that?
One way that we have been that I've been doing it mainly is to tell stories of groups of friends who changed each other and changed the world too. One of my favorite stories is about the relationship between Martin Luther King and the Zen Buddhist priest, Thich Nhat Hanh, who really shaped Martin Luther King's approach to the Beyond Vietnam speech, his most famous anti-war speech. And in turn, King's ideas of beloved community, Thich Nhat Hanh adapted into his practice, and after King's assassination, made a central part of his teaching. And he went on to build a global following of millions of Buddhist practitioners who are very active in their communities and in civics as well. So they met up a couple of times, not often in the 60s, but Thich Nhat Hanh had been exiled from Vietnam and was living in the United States. So proximity, creating some opportunities for people to actually be together and get to know each other. And then I think mutual respect and trust develop through actually doing things together. I have been over these few decades part of many movement building, quote unquote, efforts that were designed to bring people working in different communities and different issues together to find commonality and potentially collaborative things to do together. And my observation is that talking together is a good start, but true trust, knowing that you have similar goals or aligned goals, knowing that you're going to show up for the things that you said you would do, you have integrity, those things happen through acting together. They don't happen through conversation alone.
Now, are there any projects afoot to encourage narrative development or even storytelling development of traditionally marginalized groups where we could use some of that narrative?
Yeah, actually, we are recruiting right now for a program we are about to run the second year of. It's called the Changemaker Authors Cohort. Our partners in this are a great group of editors and writing coaches and teachers at the Unicorn Authors Club. The way this program runs is that we recruit people who are very close to the process of making change and who have a book in them. There are a lot of problem books in the world, lots of sad stories about communities of color, disabled people, queer people, women, and lots of sad books about the issues that we face and the systems that we need to change. We need solution stories, and we need more stories that show people in action so that readers can feel less alone taking action themselves. So there's an info session that applicants can watch, and then there's an application where we'll ask you questions about your book projects. We're looking for fiction, nonfiction, and poetry, because all of those different kinds of storytelling give us opportunities to move our morals and ideas.
Rinku, it's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you today. Thank you so much.
All right. Have a great weekend.
To learn more about the Narrative Initiative, visit narrativeinitiative.org. That's narrativeinitiative.org. And for more information on the Changemakers Authors Cohort, see the blue bar at the top of the screen. Many thanks to the Samuel P. Hunt Foundation for sponsoring this podcast. Established in 1951, Samuel P. Hunt Foundation is a Manchester-based, independent nonprofit that provides grants primarily for the arts, children and youth services, faith-based organizations, educational institutions, healthcare, and human services. This podcast was brought to you by Nixon Peabody, who delivers exceptional legal services for clients in the community by combining high performance, an entrepreneurial spirit, deep engagement, and an unwavering commitment to a culture of collaboration, diversity, and humanity. Nixon Peabody works with universities, hospitals, and nonprofits of every size to maximize impact. For more information, visit nixonpeabody.com. To Today's show was also brought to you by Merrimack County Savings Bank, who proudly supports the mission and efforts of New Hampshire Children's Trust. Founded in 1867, Merrimack has served people, businesses, nonprofits, and municipalities in central and southern New Hampshire for over 155 years by treating everyone with care, respect, and compassion. Visit your local offices in Bow, Concord, Kentucky, Hooksett, and Nashua, or go to www.themerrimack.com. New Hampshire Family Now is listed on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Amazon Music, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, and more. Listen wherever you get your podcasts or ask your smart speaker to play New Hampshire Family Now.